Hello and welcome to State of Play on Mint Press News. I am your host, Greg Stoker, former U.S. military member turned anti-war activist, and now political analyst here at Mint Press News. Just to get the plug out of the way, we are demonetized here at Mint Press News, being a non-corporate affiliated, independent, small watchdog newsroom. If you're interested in supporting what we do and you're picking up what we're putting down, consider donating $5 a month to Patreon, linked below in the description. And if not, if you're getting nickeled and dimed in the throes of late stage finance capitalism, we get it. We're just glad that you're here. Like, share, and subscribe. So yeah, it's been a weekend. I just wanted to address the Elon Musk tweet from this weekend. He said he posted 14 American flags at 1:14 p.m. yesterday, and that is, yes, don't be gaslit. That is a sign or signal within the white supremacist culture that stands for the 14-word slogan. And since we're all and since all the Yahtzees are coming out of the woodwork, it's good to know what these dog whistles are. So he is currently involved in a system of communication with white supremacists, and he's not even giving dog whistles anymore. The 14-word slogan posted at 11:14 or 1:14 p.m. means, quote, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children." So when fascism comes to America, it will always be wrapped in a flag. And sorry, I don't have my producer with me, but here's the tweet: 14 American flags posted at that time. So that's fun. They're not really hiding it anymore. And I did think that this takeover and the co-opting of the government would be, a little less clownish. But in case you guys, while you're still filtering into the show, miss this is completely absurd. So the Associated Press was banned from the White House press briefings for refusing to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America.
This official made the decision to bar the AP reporter from the Oval Office and the diplomatic reception room last night.
Well, first of all, let me just set the record straight. It is a privilege to cover this White House. It's a privilege to be the White House press secretary. And nobody has the right to go into the Oval Office and ask the President of the United States questions. That's an invitation that is given. And there are hundreds of outlets on this campus, many of you in this room who don't have the privilege of being part of that pool every single day and getting to ask the President questions. We reserve the right to decide who gets to go into the Oval Office, and you all have credentials to be here, including the Associated Press, who is in this briefing room today.
But isn't it retaliatory in nature is the argument, because the reason that the AP was barred, which they said was because they're not using the phrase Gulf of America, they're using Gulf of Mexico in line with their standards. And so the question here is this setting a precedent that this White House will retaliate against reporters who don't use the language that you guys believe reporters should use? And how does that align with the First Amendment commitment that you were just talking about?
I was very upfront in my briefing on day one that if we feel that there are lies being pushed by outlets in this room, we are going to hold those lies accountable. And it is a fact that the body of water off the coast of Louisiana is called the Gulf of America. And I'm not
I can't. It does, the Gulf of America doesn't even flow trippingly off the tongue, as Hamlet would say. But this kind of brings us to our main thing today, our main subject, and that is what's going on internally in Israel. Countries learn from each other. So we're watching their government crack down on dissent. They're watching our government crack down on dissent. I don't know if you guys are tracking this, but this is going to be our first topic once we bring on our guest for today. It's going to be, one second. I don't have a producer today. So we've got Trump issues sweeping memo to review defund nonprofits and NGOs. So he's ordered a sweeping review of federal funding for all non-governmental organizations, including thousands of domestic violence nonprofits, everything from providing shelter to meals to advocating for Palestine. And that's the real thing. Of course, we've had now Republican operatives come out and say explicitly the TikTok ban wasn't about Chinese interference. It was about the Palestinian issue and giving political cover for Israel to continue its multi-generational campaign of ethnic cleansing. To that end, we're going to talk about what's happening in both our countries, how they're both in communication, and we're going to check in what is the social and political climate in Israel. I know we haven't been talking about that as much. We had like the Super Bowl and everything, but yeah, I mean, there's so much stuff going on right now in our own country, and it feels like it's inescapable that some of this has gotten lost, and I haven't been doing as much reporting on the Palestine issue as I wanted to have been. So to that end, we are joined by Yahav Erez, who is an activist against the ongoing Nakba and works for an Israeli human rights organization that aims to dismantle ethnic cleansing and apartheid in West Bank. She is the creator and host of Disillusioned, a podcast that tells the stories of how Israelis have been breaking free of the indoctrination they were raised to believe, and volunteers with Zochrot, the first organization to call for the return of Palestinian refugees, and that educates Israelis about the Nakba. Yahav, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So I guess we just want to start with kind of coming out the intro. What's going on with NGO? You work for an NGO. I know that you're here in your own personal capacity, not as a spokesperson. But could you give us just an idea of what's happening with the crackdown on any sort of political dissenting nonprofits in Israel?
Sure. I just want to correct one thing about the bio. Zochrot, the organization that was mentioned, it's the first Israeli organization that calls for a right of return of Palestinians, not the first organization generally. Of course, Palestinian organizations are the first. But right. Yeah, it's important because I'm very proud to be part of their community and to work for right of return of Palestinians. So about your question, so there's these two bills that are being promoted currently, and it looks like the government is very keen on advancing them quickly. What they will do is essentially make all Israeli human rights organizations have to close down, because the crackdown is on two different channels, two parallel channels. One is on the funding, because Israeli human rights organizations actually are funded mostly by foreign governments, of course, governments that have an interest in democratic values, that have some kind of relation with Israel, usually also funding many different institutions in Israel, but also want to still contribute to upholding human rights. And so they are, very, very much the majority of the funds of these organizations. And so the idea is to tax these funds by like 80%, giving like an 80% tax to these funds. Although it doesn't really matter, even if it's 1%, 80%, 90%, because these governments actually can't legally give these funds as long as there is any taxation, because that would be considered funneling money directly to the Israeli government, and that's illegal in these countries. So any taxation of funds to human rights organizations in Israel means that the major source of funding will disappear. And there's also a clause in this specific bill that says that any organizations that are funded by foreign governments will have to report anytime they file a petition to the High Court of Justice, and then the High Court of Justice will have the right to, not to decline addressing that petition. So this means that legal work of these organizations will be going out the window, because the High Court will not have to address their petitions, which is a major part of many of our organizations' work. The second bill that's being advanced is a bill that is allegedly supposed to protect Israelis from the ICC. And it's very long. There's a lot of description of how exactly this bill will help protect Israeli officials and Israeli soldiers from international tribunals. But there's this specific clause there that says that if you are transferring information that is being used by the ICC to investigate alleged crimes being carried out by Israel, then you can face a 5-year prison sentence. But the interesting part is that it's not only if you knowingly directly transfer information, on your own initiative to the ICC, but it's also if information that you have published is being used by the ICC and you didn't make sure that it's not being used by the ICC, which basically includes any information that's publicly, published.
But that just makes even that's a crackdown on journalists, because
Yes.
everything that they publish is open source and can be referenced by the ICC.
Exactly. Yeah. It's also a crackdown on journalists. That's true. But of course, research that's been done by these organizations has been used, we're assuming, for this, these investigations, since we have been reporting for years on violations of human rights of Palestinians by the state of Israel. And there's also the question of whether this is, retroactive and who is going to be responsible. And basically, it's trying to criminalize the idea of giving any information that can be used by the ICC. So, this is very scary. And I don't know how this is going to end, but at this point, everybody's on edge and trying to get the word out, to the international community. This is also the kind of moves that totalitarian regimes have performed in the past in other places around the world, all in under the pretext of advancing. The titles are always very positive, like protecting Israelis from the ICC, or they're giving these misleading titles to these bills. But if you really read through it, you'll see that the aim is to crack down on human rights or NGOs, journalists, like you said. So it's very clear this is the attack.
Yeah, and yes, it's always national security, defending jobs, cutting government waste, and stopping foreign interference, and that's how it begins. So we're seeing similar things over here, just done differently, slightly differently, just because we have a different legal system and constitution. So anyways, let's start with some current news. Yesterday, Secretary of Defense Marco Rubio, who's also received over $1.5 million in campaign contributions from AIPAC, the Israel lobby in the United States, said he was working, basically just traveled to Tel Aviv. He's now in Saudi Arabia, starting the negotiations to hopefully end the Russia war in Ukraine. But he basically endorsed Netanyahu's plans. And here is the current prime minister's thoughts on the meeting. This is the press statement that came out earlier this morning. Sorry, again, pulling this up. This is our least favorite political leader right now. Second, I don't know, it's hard to keep track. And
Secretary Rubio and I discussed President Trump's bold vision for Gaza, for Gaza's future, how we can work together to ensure that future becomes a reality. We will eliminate Hamas's military capability, and
I want to circle back to this idea of defeating Hamas's military capability, and if people in Israel actually believe that's an achievable goal. But anyways, putting that aside for a second.
Its political rule in Gaza. We will bring all our hostages home, and we will ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat to Israel. President Trump and I are working in full cooperation and coordination between us. We have a common strategy, and we can't always share the details of this strategy with the public, including when the gates of hell will be opened, as they surely will if all our hostages are not released until the last one of them. Israel and America stand shoulder to shoulder in countering the threat of Iran. We agreed that the Ayatollahs must not have nuclear weapons. And we also agreed that Iran's aggression in the region has to be rolled back. Over the last 16 months, Israel has dealt a mighty blow to Iran's terror axis. Under the strong leadership of President Trump, and with your unflinching support, I have no doubt that we can and will finish the job.
Finish the job. Mission accomplished. It's almost like U.S. and Western interference in the region over the past 20 years really hasn't accomplished any of its goals. So I guess my first question to you is like, what, and it's hard to characterize, again, there's a huge media landscape. There's a lot of dissent within Israeli media. It's actually quite like a rich and diverse thing. I think it's still highly problematic from my perspective, but what is the conversation about all of this right now? Could you characterize it or at least offer some sort of commentary for the outsider? Just because from my perspective, it's like, how is any of this achievable?
I think maybe we should start by something that is very clear, I believe, to most of Israeli society at this point, and this is something that was just screened, was Netanyahu pretending like he cares about the hostages. This is maybe one of the biggest lies that it's very clear by now, I think, to majority of Israelis that this government, and specifically Netanyahu, really, really do not care if the Israeli hostages just, rot there in Gaza until they die. And I think this is something that maybe is one of the only thing that you can, that many Israelis can agree on is that, our government, all of us know now that if something like this happens to any of us, our government will not do whatever it takes to bring us, home safely. On the contrary, they will probably use us cynically as justification to do horrible things to Palestinians, which is what has happened.
Yeah. As another arm of like atrocity propaganda, they take hostages, so bomb them relentlessly.
Yes, and actually one of the amazing guests on my podcast in the last episode that I recorded said a very true sentence that I would like to reiterate. She said, people claim that Israel has the right to defend itself. No, Israel has the obligation to protect its citizens, which it has not been doing. On the contrary, when Israel uses the hostages as justification for carpet bombing Gaza, their intention is not to save hostages. Their intention is not to protect their own citizens, but rather their intention is to harm Palestinians. And this is just so clear at this point. I think that there are also people in Israeli society that don't care about the hostages themselves anyway. So it's not like they would.
I do recall seeing footage of like far right, like extremist settlers actually fighting the cops who were releasing some Palestinians from prison, like children and stuff, and they're like getting arrested and basically rioting over that.
So actually, you could say the extreme violent settlers are very organized in their mobilization of anyone who wants to join them in rioting in the West Bank. And if they have any kind of excuse for it, then they use it specifically. So, for example, there's WhatsApp groups in which they are updating which Palestinian prisoners are being released and where they're from, what village or town or city they're from in the West Bank, and what time they're estimating the bus will reach from prison to that village. And they organize and mobilize people to come to the entrance to that village and block the entrance, which is, laundered term for rioting and invading that village and attacking Palestinians and also blocking the roads so that Palestinians can't pass freely and can't, restricting their freedom of movement even more. And so this is not new. I mean, these WhatsApp groups that, or have this organized method of, calling people to come and join them in their demonstrations, which are actually riots. It's meant to do two things. One is just to give yet another excuse to attack Palestinians in the West Bank, which they do anyway on a daily basis. But two is to sabotage the hostage deal and the ceasefire, because these people are from the exact demographic that I was describing that really feel like a ceasefire and releasing hostages is something that is only going to cause us more danger in the future, because of this very distorted logic that says that because certain released prisoners in the past have been involved in violent acts against Israeli citizens, that means that releasing Palestinian prisoners at large is strategically dangerous, which is a very weird logic if you really look at the facts. But I think this is a very pretty large demographic in Israel that believe or buy into this story of like, we can't release prisoners, we can't release Palestinian prisoners. Of course, they would never call them prisoners, they would call them terrorists, but we can't release Palestinian prisoners because that will create another October 7th. And their proof is, and this is of course very simplistic, but their proof is that some of the leaders of Hamas that were leading the October 7th attack were also released in the Gilad Shalit deal, which in 2011, October 2011, released an Israeli soldier that was abducted by Hamas into Gaza, and 5 years later, 1,000 Palestinian prisoners were released in exchange for him. And they're using this logic as if like we're not learning from history, because this is what happened with the prisoners that were released in the Shalit deal. And so if we now release more prisoners, they'll just go back to, terror and violence, and then we're gonna keep suffering.
And that was the same hostage event that led to the development and implementation of the totally never used Hannibal Doctrine as well, because there was this institutional decision that it was just too painful to deal with a hostage situation like that again. That's what I've seen and what I've kind of determined based off of like battle damage assessments from October 7th and stuff like that. But so yeah, there's a lot of people in Israel who are against like the hostage deal. This was a poll done by Time. This came out last year. Despite thousands of protesters gathering in Tel Aviv to demand the release of hostages held by Hamas, only 10% of Israelis, Jews in the Israel Democracy Institute poll said they would support a pause in fighting in order to exchange hostages. Meanwhile, 44.3% said they want the government to negotiate for the hostages immediately without pausing the fighting. Again, that was from a year ago. So I guess what's the main consensus here now? Because we're seeing now articles in Haaretz, where there's massive protests that mark the 500 days since October 7th. I guess, like, what are they demanding? Because, like, without a ceasefire, they're not going to get the hostages back. It just seems like there's a lot of dissonance as an outsider with what's going on and the socio-cultural thrust of what's happening right now.
I mean, throughout the history of the state of Israel, cognitive dissonance was basically the bread and butter of our existence. So it's not like this is new, really. But it's interesting because the attitudes toward the hostage deal, ceasefire, forcible transfer of people in Gaza to other countries that is like on the table right now. and mainly because of Trump. But actually, there was talk about this before internally. It's just that Trump kind of let it. He kind of normalized or legitimized this idea in the Israeli, mainstream discourse. But all of these conversations happening about these topics, I could say, are a very, very strong proof of the sentence, every accusation is a confession, because Israelis for years, and this is something I heard growing up, and every Israeli hears this growing up, and still to this day, it's a very, one of the, 15 talking points of the Zionist regime or of the Israeli lobby or whatever you want to call it, is that they care more about harming us than they do about their own children. And this is a perfect example of how that accusation is actually a confession. Because
didn't Golda Meir say that as well?
Yeah, of course.
Something along those lines. Yeah.
But the thing is these statements are not only are they false, but they're actually the opposite. And as you go along in the history of the state of Israel, and you go farther and farther until you hit this point, you'll see the extreme, negative of that, like claiming that they want to harm us more than they want to protect their own children, while we're doing exactly that, while we are all insisting on these imaginary goals like destroying Hamas, which some of us, I think a minority of us, knew was impossible from day one. But
I mean, just look at America's global war on terror.
Yeah, it's the same idea.
No matter look at the Vietnam War. No matter how you feel about Hamas as an organization, there's a lot of historical precedent about how a massive aerial bombing campaign is not going to get the job done.
Exactly, and definitely leaving your citizens as hostages in the arms of this organization that you would like to destroy, and claiming that the two main goals of this war is to release the hostages and destroy Hamas, is definitely the most grotesque dissonance that you could imagine. Because, and this is what's really sad, is that many Israelis are only kind of slowly understanding this now, once they're seeing what actual negotiation and hostage deals and ceasefires are actually doing. But they are now stating publicly, well, if we want to destroy Hamas, but our, loved ones are actually being held by Hamas, then, well, maybe 1 + 1 is to, where I'm going. Like, How are we expecting to destroy Hamas if they are the ones holding the people that we want back safe and alive? Like that, those two are, they contradict each other. And so this was very clear to some of us from, like I said, from day one. You can't go to war claiming that you're doing it to destroy Hamas and to release the hostages. And you definitely can't destroy everything but, everything
Hamas.
But, because especially, and still claim that. And now this is being revealed as every time there's a swap, every time there's another batch of hostages being released, you're seeing Hamas very, deliberately showing the world in these ceremonies that not only are they not destroyed, but they are, alive and still going on, going at it. And so I think that Israelis are watching this, and some people are saying, well, it looks like that goal has not been achieved. And it definitely seems like maybe it can't be achieved if after so much destruction, Hamas is still alive and well. But what's really tragic is that the Israeli media, the Israeli criminal media, is doing everything but addressing this point. They're mainly using these, the broadcasts of the hostage deal, the swaps. They're mainly using it to just demonize Hamas, which seems to me, from what I gather from living here, there's no real need of. People here.
Yeah.
It's not like people loved Hamas, like Israeli Jews loved Hamas, and now they really need that extra kick of, oh, they're so horrible and barbaric. But that's exactly what the Israeli media is focusing on, and focusing on only is look at how horrible.
What I thought was so interesting about, I mean, Hamas, just from a objective like information operations perspective, as someone that used to do this in the military, they're pretty sophisticated about it. So what they've used these hostage videos in the ceremonies to communicate directly with the Israeli people. And even if they're not going to get them on side or like have any like reflection about it, they still see like, oh wow, there's a lot of them. Wow, what was accomplished over the past 15 months? And again, like, I get it. I was in the military and I thought that somehow the US, after like 40 years of nation building in Afghanistan, would finally have a government that we installed, that the Afghan people liked and wanted to fight for, and that the Taliban would just go away. So I get like being completely separate from reality. But we also saw in the clip from the current prime minister of Israel, this idea that Iran, we have to take it to Iran. As a lot of this audience knows, because they're historically aware, after 9/11, Iran was like up on the target deck of next country that we were going to topple. It was supposed to be like Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Syria, then Iran. And Iran knew like they weren't going to cry about Saddam Hussein being overthrown, but they knew they were next. So they got involved in the war. They created EFPs, explosively formed penetrators. They armed militias in Iraq in order to bog us down, less so in Afghanistan, so that we couldn't refocus on Iran. And they built this idea of the axis of resistance, because regardless of what you think of their own government, like, we were the imperialist nation coming into that region, and we were trying to take down the government. So a lot of this rhetoric, I mean, Netanyahu, I feel like it's his political fever dream, and always has been, to get the United States involved in a war with Iran on behalf of Israel. And how important of an issue is Iran to the average Israeli? Do they really see it as an existential threat?
I think they do see it as an existential threat, but I mean, after the attacks from Iran that, in the past year, didn't do harm to Israelis, in fact, as much as the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, and, other organizations that are in the region. And so, on the most pragmatic level, Iran is a scary notion. And we know that they have nuclear power, so it is. I mean, personally, it is scary. Like, like, we don't know what's going to happen, but definitely, I think most of the Israeli public is much more preoccupied with Palestinians, and specifically Palestinians in Gaza, and see Palestinians in Gaza, and specifically Hamas, as the number one threat to our existence, more than a nuclear power. At this point, that's been established, at least.
Right. Well, it was just an interesting thing, because I get it's kind of rhetoric, but I just wanted to bring this foundational foreign policy paper written by the Brookings Institute in 2009. I brought it up on 2 other episodes, but it's called an analysis paper. It's Which Path to Persia? It's, from the Saban Center for Middle East Policy. And if you're like, that sounds like it's related to Haim Saban, the ex-IDF soldier billionaire who owns Universal Records, it absolutely is. So anyways, this is what has kind of crafted U.S.
Who, by the way, I just want to say, by the way, he also brought Power Rangers to the U.S. Just an anecdote.
Wait, he was responsible for Power Rangers?
Well, Power Rangers is originally Japanese, and he's the one that kind of like introduced it to the U.S. So that's like his that was his his break.
Oh, okay.
Career-wise, yeah.
Well, he's definitely done some other less uh, fun and bubbly stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not really going to go into this, but this is the introduction. This entire analysis paper basically walks through every solution. So the first one, you have diplomatic options. It advises against it. Then you have disarming Tehran, the military option. The situation, the strategic situation hasn't changed. So we have like going all the way, invasion. Then you have the OCROC option, and the OCROC airstrikes where we got Israel to bomb nuclear reactors in the Levant instead of us, because we couldn't do that politically at the time. And then we have leave it to Bibi, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. And part 3 is regime change. Chapter 6, the Velvet Revolution, which means a nonviolent uprising, inspiring an insurgency. Then we have the coup. And then we have what has been our policy since the global war on terror, and that is containment, accepting the unacceptable. Containment. And we're going to continue with containment under Trump. That's an interesting historical artifact. We will link that in the description if you want to read it, because it's still just as relevant now as it was back then. The direct military option is not feasible for the United States, especially with the ongoing recruiting crisis. So that's nice. I think we're just going to continue to use Iran as the big bad guy in the region, which is why we need to stay involved, and we must fund Israel and give it whatever bombs it needs, no matter what. But moving on to something that's probably more relevant, that you said they're more preoccupied with, it seems like the Lebanon ceasefire is in danger of falling apart. I know the idea there's been a gag order on casualties, but if that kicks off again, are people sick of fighting? Do they understand like how many casualties have been taken? Because I know it's not reported in the media, unless there's like a big mass casualty event where like 5 soldiers die.
There are people who are sick of fighting. Some are also sick of sending their, partners or children to fight. Of course, there is that sentiment, and this is, of course, one of the main, arguments when it comes to trying to convince the Israeli public at large, or a critical mass of Israeli public, to go against the war or to call for a ceasefire. Time and again, there's this argument that says, well, we'd rather convince them that it's not to their benefit, that they should call for a ceasefire because they are, because of their own casualties, because of what we're losing as Israelis internally, and we don't have to convince them, with the moral argument of we're committing a genocide, or we're committing war crimes against innocent civilians, or giving, information about how much we've, completely destroyed everything in Gaza. But there's this kind of trying to shift it to, well, let's convince them that it's to their own, it's in their own interest to end the war. And the problem with that, even though it is the most effective, it is true, it's much more effective to convince someone that it's for their own good to do something. But the problem is that the war technologies are progressing as time goes by, and it basically enables us to develop technology that is able to destroy them, but not, endanger us less. So, we used to have to use more humans, right? If we were bombing. Now there are just drones. And so we don't have to endanger our own soldiers to that extent like we used to. And so we can just keep developing more and more, as you say, like unarmed or unmanned,
UAVs.
Exactly, technologies, so that we don't feel the loss and that we can do everything we still want to do to them. And that's the problem, because then we'll just, we'll keep doing that. And then we won't have to stop the war for our own good, because we won't be, we won't have as many casualties. And not to say that we don't have casualties right now. Of course we do, and that's the certain percentage that are tired of fighting that you've mentioned. But it's very dangerous. The claim that we should end the war for our own good is a dangerous one because of warfare technology. And I also want to add, there's an acquaintance of mine who I think is very brave, and I'm actually going to interview him on my podcast as well. And he actually, his background is being a very violent settler, and today he's a human rights lawyer. So he's also an Israeli who's, shifted to the complete 180 degrees. And his brother was killed as a soldier in Gaza, as he was in reserves. And he, of course, has been mourning for a year. And recently he came out with a post saying, I used to think that my brother, was a hero and that he died defending the country and defending me and the rest of the family. And now I understand that he died for nothing, because I understand that they are lying to us. They are telling us that we're, sacrificing our sons and daughters and friends and loved ones for this, for certain goals. And then we discover that actually the only goal here is to serve Netanyahu's, endless regime, and that nobody really cares about what happens to Israelis. The only goal here is a political goal that will only bring destruction to everybody. And it's tragic because people have been losing, been sacrificing their loved ones. And now slowly, for some of them, I believe, whether they want to admit it or not, it's sinking in that their loved ones were, died for nothing. They died for Netanyahu's control, his thirst for power, and for the thirst for political control of, the messianic right wing in Israel, wanting to resettle Gaza, wanting to annex the West Bank. So these appetites for control, and the people who are paying the prices are, of course, the people on the ground. And I think it's tragic because it's the indoctrination that we grow up with that convinces us in the first place that soldiers going to fight in a war are actually protecting their country or protecting their communities and their families. That's one of the biggest lies. Israeli wars, have not much to do with protecting Israeli lives or Israel, and mostly with maintaining power and expanding the power, both in the Middle East and on Palestinians. And that's the bottom line. It's about controlling the Palestinians and about preventing them from any kind of freedom or self-determination. And it's not about protecting Israelis, because if it was about protecting Israelis, then there wouldn't still be hostages after 500 days.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like when I try to reach out to veterans who are still buying the Kool-Aid about U.S. intervention overseas. I was like, dude, you have to realize, like, we sacrificed our youth and buried our friends for the sake of imperialist lies. But coming out of that is very difficult to get someone to do. My question, though, is, yeah, Netanyahu is doing this, but even if he lost, well, obviously he lost the support of Ben Gvir. Eventually, if he alienates another power broker like Smotrich, and his coalition gets disrupted, even if a somewhat more moderate person like Yair Lapid would come in, would it change policy at all?
Probably only when it comes to the Israeli hostages. But I mean, Lapid was in control before this current government, and he had the same policies towards Palestinians, and so did all of the Israeli governments from 1948 until today. I mean, it's true that this particular government is very, public about their real intentions, and they're not hiding anymore, and their masks are off. But if you actually look at the policies themselves, if you let the policies speak, and if you let the facts on the ground speak, throughout the past, 76 years, it's been the same line, the same policies, is see Palestinians first as threats and then as humans, and do anything we can to keep their heads down, and to completely destroy their unity, their lives, their any kind of sovereignty, any kind of continuity, demographic, on every level, trying to just destroy Palestinians and only seeing their existence as a threat to Israel. And a great example of that is not even military, but rather cultural, you could say, or cultural and political. As last week, there was a bookstore in East Jerusalem owned by a Palestinian family for generations. It's called
I saw this.
Shop. And the raid on the bookshop and the arrest of two brothers who were owners of this bookshop was just exactly the definition of how much Israelis believe that Palestinian identity is the major threat to our existence. More than Iran, more than anything, it's a coloring book that says "From the River to the Sea" on it, or any book that has the colors of the Palestinian flag, or a map, of historic Palestine. It's almost, if it wasn't sad, it would be funny, because this has been you could say, this has been the course of action for all Israeli governments since 1948, is just, focus on crushing Palestinian identity and Palestinian, resistance.
Yeah, but don't be too crazy about it, because we don't want to become a pariah state in the post-World War II era where you're not supposed to do genocides or ethnic cleansing anymore and still survive. So it's always been this big balancing act. One of the big problems, like internationally, the multi-generation effort of Hezbollah for a lot of people around the world has been dismantled over the past 15 months just because of the unnecessary, the insane bombing campaign. I won't even get it. I've done plenty of military analysis of Israeli action, but I'm glad you brought up the bookstore, because right now what's happening in the West Bank in terms of clearing people out of their ancestral homes is kind of unprecedented in terms of scale since when, 67?
So this is actually part of a wider plan. Smotrich is, of course, Bezalel Smotrich is leading
Say
this.
the quiet part out loud, no matter what, in the most egregious language.
Yeah. So he's leading this plan to annex the West Bank, and as part of this plan, clearing out the more rural, areas of the West Bank, mostly what is termed Area C, which is about 65% of the West Bank, is mostly where farmers and shepherds are residing, and smaller villages, and of course where almost all the settlements are. And so the idea is to ethnically cleanse Area C and push Palestinians into the smaller urban areas A and B. I don't know if you have a map.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So area C, I guess, is the blue, and area B and A, which are the city centers, they could be put in there, confined and ghettoized easier.
So, yeah, the larger urban areas in the West Bank are supposed to be these basically Bantustans or ghettos that are overcrowded and have nowhere to develop and nowhere to grow. And the idea is to, this is all also this is all specified in the decisive plan. I'm assuming that you're familiar with the decisive plan, but Smotrich has based his work on the decisive plan, and the annexation of the West Bank is part of that. And it basically wants to make these people's lives impossible so that they just move into the larger cities and towns and, are confined to those small areas so that the larger, open rural areas are all under complete control of Israel. And this is, you've got it exactly.
So just for context for the audience, the decisive plan is basically what the idea that there is like two-state solution is a dead end. There's no way that we can contemplate two different national movements, one for Israel and one for Palestine. So it needs to decisively be destroyed.
Yeah, it's also claiming, and he is basing his argument on one thing that I think me and him can agree on, and that managing the occupation is unsustainable, which we are now seeing. It's not only expensive, but it has other costs, like cost of lives, and eventually it is bound to explode, which is what October 7th was. It was the explosion of this maintaining the occupation doctrine that many in Israeli society accepted for years, basically since, at least for the past decade. And I think we can agree that that does not work. We can't just maintain the occupation and, make it manageable and make it, just comfortable enough for Palestinians to somehow accept it, which is, I don't understand how someone is expecting anyone to accept that kind of life. But then he says, but then there's two ways to go. There's the ways that says, well, we have to reach an agreement and we have to go into negotiation. We have to work for a solution that actually gives people their basic rights and actually respects their lives. Or you could go to the other direction, which is where Smotrich went, which is, no, we need the decisive plan, which is basically, in other words, the final solution, which is basically saying we're not going to maintain and we're not going to give them rights and we're not going to support the idea of them being liberated. We'll go the 180 degrees opposite, which is we're just going to, in short, make it one country in control, complete control from the river to the sea. And it's going to be a Jewish state. And any Palestinian who will accept this will be able to live in that state with, an inferior status in these Bantustans, and we'll give them some rights. We'll let them basically live, but nothing more. And then if you don't agree with this, if you're Palestinian and you don't agree with this, then you're being ethnically cleansed away and you need to be expelled. Basically, this is the two options that Palestinians are given as part of the decisive plan.
Right, and so it's just, where would they go though?
Exactly. Well,
is there any critical thought around that? Like, Egypt can't take them into the Sinai; they'll have another Bedouin uprising, and like Jordan could completely collapse. For a whole host of incredibly complicated geopolitical reasons. And then, of course, Europe's not going to take after like they're freaking out over the Syria migrant crisis during the Syrian civil war, and now the U.S.'s anti-immigrant position. Where?
So this is exactly the kind of delusional mindset that stems from settler colonialist mindset. Because when you have a settler colonialist mindset, you actually are blind to the basic facts on the ground and the geopolitical reality. And so you think that these weird delusional ideas of transferring millions of people to Jordan or to Egypt or to wherever somehow makes sense. And it's the same logic that says that Palestinians, if we work hard enough and if we convince them, then they will forget about the right of return. And this is policies that Israel has been carrying out for years and years, claiming that all they need is a good quality of life. And if they have a good quality of life anywhere, then they will forget where they come from and they will forget their homeland and they'll forget the right of return. And all we have to make sure is that they're comfortable enough. And this also was implemented in Gaza, by the way, during, decades ago. But it's also what leads this fixation with UNRWA, because the part of the fixation with UNRWA that Israeli right-wing, organizations have been pushing for years, and not before October 7th, this has to be stated. They've been pushing this myth for years and years, and now this myth that they've created somehow has been reaching these real serious, being addressed seriously by the EU, and it's just ridiculous because, as a very, very wise colleague of mine said, Palestinians don't need UNRWA to remember that they want to return to their homes, because Jewish people didn't need a refugee.
I was going to bring this up. This ideation is completely detached from the entire premise of Zionism in the first place.
Exactly. It's like Zionists will claim that Palestinians just need, some kind of condition to forget their right of return, while they have been claiming that their right to this land is thousands of years old. Like Jewish people didn't forget, where we come from. So why would Palestinians forget? And there's also this claim, and this drives me crazy, is that Israeli mainstream thinks that Palestinians hate us so much that they're willing to kill and be killed for this hatred, and that this hatred doesn't stem from living a life of refugees and being, deprived of basic human rights, but rather it stems from indoctrination and education. And again, like I said, every accusation is a confession, because Palestinians, of course, don't need to be exposed to certain content so that they, have a hatred of the occupation and feel like they support armed resistance, right? We know that there's much more support for Hamas since October 7th than ever there was before. And this is not what the mistake that the mindset of the settler colonialism will lead you to, is thinking that they need certain kind of, content to convince them of that. So, school books, and finding school books of, UNRWA schools in Gaza, and using that as proof that actually all of, the hatred toward Israel and Israeli stems from there. No, the hatred towards Israel and Israeli stems from living under an occupation and being deprived of your rights and being deprived of ever going back to your lands in such a brutal way. But Israelis aren't even aware of those brutal ways and aren't even aware of the real history. And so why would they know that? And that takes me back to the bookstore, because Israelis are truly convinced that a coloring book that says "From the River to the Sea" is what makes Palestinians hate us. And that's exactly the same, like I said, it's the same mindset that's delusional, that somehow thinks that a coloring book is what will make people go and take up arms, and join a guerrilla group, armed group. No, that's not what makes someone angry, and now it's not what makes someone use violence.
No, maybe it has something to do with the overwhelming majority of Hamas ground troops being orphans. Maybe we should look into that. Why are they orphans?
Of course.
So, it's kind of, well, I mean, it's just also the double standard that we have here in the United States. Like, I grew up as a pretty well-to-do white kid in Texas. No one was trying to take anything from me, but because I volunteered to go into a special operations unit and fight in an illegal war 5 times, people were like, "Thank you for your service." It's like, dude, if I was born under an occupation based on my personality type, I don't know, probably wouldn't have been a baker. So,
However, we also know that the military in Israel and in the US and probably in other countries, because this is what militaries do, they prey on marginalized societies, and they take advantage of marginalized communities, and they take advantage of people, some of them also from the settler population. They take advantage of these, weaknesses and lower class citizens to give them all these perks and give them all these incentives to serve in the military. And this, of course, is another part of the ethos of the service in Israel as a soldier. Of course, it's not the major part, but I mean, I am not proud of this, but my bachelor's degree was almost fully funded by just the fact that I had served in the military, in the Israeli military, and they fund people's school in certain universities, in certain colleges. But it's like, and nobody really starts questioning this unless they really go, far out to start actually questioning Zionism and questioning this, the mythology that we're basing our existence on here. And I think it's the same in every society, but there's different conditions, you could say. Like, no society is immune from becoming genocidal, and no society is immune from becoming so brainwashed that they can't even see the most basic things, like, where the hell do you think they're going to move to? Like, we're not going to forcibly transfer them to Jordan and Egypt. Like, think logically. I'm not even mentioning compassion, right? I'm just mentioning the logic. But this is, if you don't use critical thinking and you don't actually respect critical thinking and critical thinking spaces that develop that in your society, then you end up, anyone can end up as brainwashed and as, violent as our society. And this is what's so sad, that we're not learning from history, and we're not, of course, us Jews are not learning from history, or at least the Zionist Jews are not learning from history. But as we speak, there's a genocide happening, and people are kind of repeating the same kind of mistakes of saying, just villainizing or, vilifying a whole society, instead of saying, well, this is how fascism works. This is how fascism rises. And we can see these patterns if we look around in different societies, in different countries with different histories. But the fascism and and this is what we started the conversation from, and the trying to put down critical thinking and, anyone who will speak up about wrongdoings is a problem everywhere. And
it's a Marxist. that's the rhetoric we're having here in America.
That it's Marxist. That's actually the same thing. It's the same claim that they had against the ANC in South Africa, and they put them on trial for being quote unquote Marxist, for being communist, even though the Freedom Charter had nothing to do with communism. It had to do with freedom and equality, basic things.
Yeah, in the book Anatomy of Fascism, the author talks about like how each nationalistic movement is different, because they all look different, but like it's the same playbook that we're seeing here in the United States, there in Israel, and burgeoning in Europe.
Yeah, and another thing that you brought up in the beginning about calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, it's so interesting how there's so many parallels, because recently there was a new bill proposed in the Israeli parliament that basically suggests that we will not be able, in any official document, institutional document in Israel, the West Bank will be termed Judea and Samaria. This is the bill, right? It's like it's the what was it called in 1984? It's like this newspeak, right? Was that
double speak?
Double speak. Like, if you just change the terminology, and then we can change reality, right?
And also reduce the use of like 3-syllable words and dumb everything down horrendously. Yeah, so we're seeing that, but changing names to the Gulf of America and Judea and Samaria will definitely bring down the price of groceries and stop foreign investment from no longer investing in Israeli businesses. But yeah, I'm sure that'll be good. So okay, so my last question then is, do you think people are going to like wake up? Like, how do you see a transformation process? Do you think it's pretty much like hopeless? Like the majority of people in your country will be locked into this kind of ideology. And there's different degrees of it. You have the extremist settlers all the way to, the more like liberal, like metropolitan Zionists that like read Haaretz and the New York Times, and they're like, you know what, it's kind of bad what's happening in Gaza, but like, what are you gonna do about it? So, what do you see happen? I know it's hard to predict, but any
it is.
any opinions?
Every day I go through this whole roller coaster, I think, of like, for one moment believing that, that's it. They're going to understand. They're going to all get it now. And then another moment being like, oh my God, they're never going to get it. It's so hopeless. But I want to take actually an example from Hannah Arendt, a German philosopher, and her analysis of the banal of evil, because what she claimed was that people don't do evil things because they are evil. They actually do evil things to fit in and to get the benefits of acting, of conforming. And most people are conformists. And what this means is, even if a whole society is genocidal, like we're seeing right here, most people are not genocidal as individuals, but rather they're conformists. And because the conforming, the consensus right now in Israel is genocidal, then many people conform with that. And I truly believe, and I think, even though, of course, Germany has a lot of work to do, and it seems like they haven't really, unlearned their fascism, thoroughly enough. But
it's coming back.
Yeah. However, they were a completely genocidal society, and now they are not. You can't say that about them in terms of what they are willing to do in their personal, and personal sacrifices to annihilate a whole people. That's not the situation now. And I think it's very much a matter of what the norm is, and how do you change the norm if the norm is genocidal. Hopefully we won't need, what happened to Germany to happen to us. I mean, I'm hoping it's not going to need a military intervention, but I think you're stuck. Okay. But I do believe that norms and the consensus can change by, if we reach some kind of agreement, and there's, and that agreement actually gives people, justice and equality. And, people are now understanding that, people will understand that the consensus is now different, then they will change in response to that. I feel like there are these points, these pockets in society that can be spearheading change. And if they're able to kind of take the current in a certain direction at a certain point, people who are conformists will start conforming to that, because they'll conform to whatever they think is the consensus. And that's what Hannah Arendt taught us in The Banal of Evil, is that people will conform to evil, but they will also, I believe, conform in the other direction. I think that's possible, because I'm also seeing this around the world with the rise of pro-Palestinian activists, protesting, demonstrating, for a ceasefire, and demonstrating for Palestinian rights. And people are realizing, the connection between that and other movements that have, things that are, they're connecting the dots. And I think you're also part of this, because I hear you talking a lot about like who's investing in what, and why this is connected to that, and why climate is also connected to indigenous rights, and so on and so forth. And people are conforming to that. Some people because they actually, have critical thinking and their understanding, and some people are actually following it because they're like, okay, well, this is what is acceptable right now. This is what is normalized. This is what is, and so I'm hoping that will happen here too. And all I have to do is just, keep that hope and keep working in that direction, which is also the reason why I do my podcast, Disillusioned, because I feel like if it was possible for those people who I interview on my podcast to break free from indoctrination as minority, as someone who is, felt alone for a long time, and only then realize that they're not the only one, then it's also possible for other people. And then once you have a certain critical mass, I have the
Things can
belief.
start to change.
Yeah. So I this is what I'm trying to work for, to kind of be part of that spearheading, minority that kind of drags the majority, the conforming majority with them. But I'm not delusional. I know it seems like it's impossible right now, definitely to me. But
People said the same thing about South Africa in the 70s too,
exactly.
because it had the unconditional support of the United States even up until the bitter end. And I think just like any other colonial project, it's not gonna last forever. I think if there's one thing this war has taught us, it's that without constant supply of money on tap immediately, whenever they need it, the whole shows up. And Israel might actually just have to start getting along with its neighbors and become an actual democracy that doesn't try to defund nonprofits for talking about human rights.
Yeah, and see Palestinians as a people that deserve what any other people deserves, and see them as equal to us, whether it's equal citizens to us in one state, or whether it's equal citizens in their own state with, the same conditions that our state. It doesn't matter. At the end, if we're able to finally rehumanize and see Palestinians as our equals, then I think the rest is much easier. But that's, of course, the hardest part. So
yeah, just keep plugging along, and in the meantime, things will continue. The material conditions in America will continue to degrade, and that will have an impact on Israeli policy and what happens in Israel, and vice versa. So, well, thank you. We are out of time. Yahav, again, she is the creator and host of Disillusioned, a podcast that we'll be linking in the description. It's about how Israelis, as she mentioned, are breaking free of the indoctrination they were raised to believe. She also volunteers for Zochrot. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on. And again, we'll link your socials and everything there. So really appreciate it.
Me too.
All right, y'all. Well, thanks so much for coming on and watching. We're not doing a live Q&A this session. Sorry, we kind of ran over. I definitely did want to hit on the social cultural aspects of what's going on, because there's kind of a wall, an intentionally constructed media wall between what's happening over there and what's happening here. And that is, of course, because our media is structured in a certain way that all you guys know about. That's why you're here on Mint Press News. Again, if you want to support the channel, we are on Patreon, and we will be back next week on State of Play on Mint Press News. See you then. Cheers, y'all.